In this section, we will focus on the effects of human metabolism, the metabolism of humanity, on living organisms, particularly on different species and ecosystems. So, a few numbers to start with. I find this visual quite explicit. Since the beginning of human civilization, 83% of mammals have been lost. So, in this figure taken from the latest report of IPBES, IPBES is the International Panel for the Study of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. IPBES is like the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for Biodiversity. We have a very alarming message that is indeed confirmed by all scientific publications in the field. Species are going extinct 10 to 100 times faster than before, and this rate of extinction is accelerating. Here we see for tetrapods the different groups that have an increasing number of species disappearing, particularly over the last 100 years. What we see is that the different groups here do not face the same pressure and are not subject to the same risks of extinction. It ranges from 15% in fish to nearly 60% in cycads, which are a group of tropical plants, and the sum of all these groups leads to an astronomical figure of nearly 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. This is called the sixth mass extinction. What are the reasons for these extinctions? What are the drivers behind it? What are the reasons that these species are disappearing or are at risk of disappearing? They are obviously due to human activity and the socio-economic functioning of our societies. They can be divided into 5 major areas. The first is the alteration of land and seas. This encompasses a wide range of different factors, but we can think, for example, of urbanization or agriculture that cover significant areas. The second is exploitation, direct exploitation, particularly at sea, and as we will see, overfishing is an important factor. The third is climate change and the modification of ecosystems. The fourth is pollution. And the fifth, invasive species, which are species that come from other countries or continents and spread, destroying or altering the functioning of ecosystems. So now we will delve deeper into the details of anthropogenic pressures, that is, human actions on different ecosystems, starting with marine environments and then terrestrial environments. There is a very good review that has just been published in Nature this year, which summarizes all the pressures on marine environments, and they are listed here. What is interesting about this figure is that it not only shows the different types of pressures, but also how they are distributed over time with a fairly simple color code. The greater the pressure, the more purple it is. The less the pressure, the more yellow it is. A piece of good news, for example, is that hunting pressure, particularly whaling, was extremely significant at the turn of the century and is now greatly reduced, notably thanks to the whaling convention. We have almost entirely stopped whaling, and this pressure, for example, has decreased. In contrast, the pressure from fishing has seen a very significant increase and remains one of the most important pressures on the marine environment today. Deforestation is also a significant cause of marine ecosystem degradation. This is not straightforward, so it may be a bit difficult to understand, but deforestation induces desertification, erosion, and soil leaching. There are a lot of sediments that are retained by the roots. These sediments go into rivers, then streams, and eventually the seas. This increase in sediments tends to suffocate coastal life forms, playing an important role in the destruction of marine ecosystems. Habitat loss remains undoubtedly, of course, one of the most important drivers, whether in marine or terrestrial environments. One can think of the artificialization of coasts, the creation of ports, and other structures. In addition to these 4 historical pressures, there are 2 more recent pressures that are, so to speak, only 50 years old, or 70 now. The first is intensive agriculture, which releases a lot of fertilizers. And as we have seen, eutrophication leads to the creation of dead zones. Then there are the effects of the climate, and I would say the effects of emissions, because with the increase of CO2 in the water, we also have ocean acidification, which is one of the causes of coral disappearance. So, we are going to take a little time to look more closely at one of these pressures, namely fishing. In this graph, we can see the number of tons of fish extracted per year, which increases between the 1960s and the 1990s to reach a sort of plateau, fluctuating between 90 and 100 million tons. So it covers the entire planet. And this period between 1990 and 2016 is considered a pivotal moment because fleets are increasing, their fishing capacity is increasing, and yet we are not catching more than before. At the same time, there is another phenomenon which is aquaculture that has developed extraordinarily over the past 30 years. One can see the exponential curve. Today, more seafood and fish, such as various species, come from aquaculture than from traditional fisheries. In this graph, we see this phenomenon of an undulating plateau again. What does it mean? Given the fact that there are a number of fisheries that are now considered to be fully exploited or overexploited, it is possible, at least this is a thesis supported by a number of researchers, that we have reached the maximum of what can be fished and that we are now reaching a plateau that cannot be surpassed. This is particularly explained by Daniel Pauly, who is one of the leading experts on the subject in a film that I recommend to you about the peak of fish. Has fishing reached its maximum? And what is the state of haleutic resources? This depletion of marine resources is not inevitable. As can be seen in this figure from the article by Duarte, which I have already mentioned regarding the state of marine ecosystem biodiversity, several iconic species that were on the brink of extinction have, within a few years, been restored to acceptable levels, and some are now out of danger. This shows that effective conservation measures can restore biological diversity and the potential of ecosystems in a significant way. Now, we will move on to the terrestrial environment. To start with this slide, there is a presentation of the different major areas of the Earth and their uses. So, typically, on the surface of the Earth, you have a large portion dedicated to the oceans, as we have already seen, and therefore you have roughly 1/3 of the Earth represented by land surfaces. If we exclude uninhabitable areas, deserts and glaciers, 70% of the Earth's surface remains habitable. In these habitable lands, today, 50% of these lands are dedicated to agriculture, a large part to forests, and then the other ecosystems that are presented here. Of the 50% of land dedicated to agriculture, the largest portion, a substantial 77%, is used solely for livestock. The remainder is for cereals, vegetables, and fruit trees. So if we now look specifically and exclusively at this part, what is represented here is essentially the proportion of calories or protein intake that these hectares provide to humanity. And what is striking is that most of the space is used to produce very few calories or even very few proteins in comparison. Because raising animals requires significantly much more land than producing vegetables, fruits, or cereals. This slide presents the 5 major types of impact, or at least the most significant ones, of agriculture. There is the land, which we have already talked about. Half of the land is dedicated to agriculture, as we have just seen. It was previously noted that food and agriculture indeed account for 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, there are 3 other very important impact factors that are important to note. Agriculture accounts for 70% of freshwater consumption, making it by far the most significant user. The activity that consumes the most fresh water. Furthermore, the fertilizers used in agriculture are responsible for 80% of the eutrophication phenomenon we have observed, which in turn creates dead zones and thus the disappearance of marine ecosystems. To conclude on biodiversity, in terms of mass, we can compare livestock and wild animals. Wild animals now account for only a few percent of the total mass of large mammals and large birds living on the planet, in terms of respective weight. The vast majority, 94%, is represented by livestock. So, to look at the effects between agriculture and climate from another angle, this slide presents a number of various foods with different numbers that are arranged from green to red. The greener it is, the less greenhouse gas the food emits. The redder it is, the more it emits. And if we start by looking at tomatoes and lentils, 1 kilo of tomatoes or 1 kilo of lentils emits approximately 1 kilo of greenhouse gases, specifically in carbon equivalent. And if we now look at the other end of the spectrum, beef and lamb, we see that we are rather in the range of 27 to 40 kilo, which is 27 to 40 times more. So you have the range, the spectrum, which clearly shows that there is a factor of 40 between different products. The more we eat vegetables and grains, especially whole grains, the less our diet will emit greenhouse gases. The more we consume meat products, fish, meat, and especially red meat, the more we consume products that have emitted a lot of greenhouse gases. Another way to understand the impact of humans on living organisms, if we remember the phrase that humans have domesticated the earth, is to look at the net primary production. What is net primary production? It is the amount of living matter, in quotes, that is produced each year. So on the continents, it's about 55 gigatons of carbon, and for the oceans, it's about 8 gigatons of carbon. Thus, roughly the same amount is produced each year in the oceans and on land. We will focus on what is produced on the continents, and now look at how this primary production is used between the wild world and humanity. This is a concept we call the global human appropriation of primary production. What does that mean? It means what portion of this primary production is used by humans. We see that it was around 6 gigatons in 1910. Today it is approximately 15. It has increased significantly over 100 years, and this increase is obviously linked to the rise in population and economic production. But what we observe in this figure is that it is essentially due to the increase in agricultural land. To end this section on a positive note, I wanted to present this slide from a recently published 2019 publication, which shows the variations in vegetation cover over 2 decades. In purple, you have major deforestation and loss of vegetation cover. This is particularly true in Brazil, Madagascar, and equatorial Africa. And then, we also see a trend towards what is increasingly and commonly called greening. There is reforestation or an increase in vegetation cover, and this is particularly marked in China and India. So, we need to look in detail at where these greening effects come from a bit. The loss of primary forests and their replacement with monocultures is obviously not ideal. But a number of these projects, particularly in China, are due to major reforestation and ecosystem restoration efforts. And so it is interesting to see that on a very large scale, it is possible to achieve significant results. To now conclude this section dedicated to living beings, we can make the following observation. The limits of the biosphere's carrying capacity threaten not only our food supply and health, but also other living species, some of which are on the brink of extinction, as well as the proper functioning of ecosystems and the services they provide us. And to synthesize these concepts, there is an article from The Lancet published in 2020, which proposes to unite these 3 forms of health, human health, species health, and ecosystem or environmental health, into a single concept, which is one health, the health of the biosphere, if you will, of which humans are a part. The interest of this concept is that it has the merit of bringing together things that are sometimes opposed, or that have tended to be opposed in the past, namely human health. Do we have to choose between the health of humans, the health of animals, or the health of ecosystems? In this type of political or economic trade-off, it is clear that this concept allows us to bring together the different pieces of the puzzle. And now we need to look holistically at how we can improve human health by improving the functioning of ecosystems and restoring biodiversity. One way to illustrate the importance of this concept is perhaps to look at the section dedicated to the emergence of antibiotic-resistant microorganisms at the top left, or to see the emergence of new viruses or new bacteria. The COVID crisis of 2020 clearly illustrates the importance of systemic thinking. Human health and environmental health are 2 things that are intimately connected. In the following slides, I will present some of the trends that indicate we will need to delve further into this metabolism for demographic reasons, economic reasons, and basic necessity reasons, which will therefore add, from a human perspective, a certain number of pressures on resources and ecosystems. Why? The first reason is quite simple. It is demographics. We are currently at 7.8 billion people, and according to United Nations predictions, the population is expected to peak between 2050 and 2100, 2000 between 2050 and 2100, and then what? The good news about this is that I have included on this slide the United Nations trends from about 10 years ago, which predicted a peak of 11 billion in 2100. I have included in this article published in The Lancet this year a downward revision of its forecasts. Instead of peaking at around 11 billion in 2100, there are different scenarios. The reference scenario peaks at just under 10 billion in 2064 before reaching 8.8 billion in 2100. And then, what is interesting is the SDG scenario, which is the Sustainable Development Goals scenario. If humanity manages to find the path to sustainability, which I will detail a little bit later, then we indeed achieve a peak much earlier and a faster decline. which would still indicate in the end a considerable difference from the peak of over 1 billion and by 2100 over 2 billion individuals. And fewer populations mean fewer impacts on the environment and easier solutions to find for cohabiting with the different species on the planet. So the key parameters that explain the difference between the reference scenario and the SDG scenario are girls' education and access to contraception, which help accelerate the demographic transition in countries that have not yet completed it. So in the next 30 years, we will have a population that will increase anyway. We do not yet know exactly by how much. And then we also have a global population that still suffers from poverty, even extreme poverty. Here on this graph, it shows the number of people in extreme poverty since the 1990s. We can see that there has been a very significant reduction, notably thanks to the economic development of China. But there remains an entire population, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, that aspires to better living conditions. And we are talking about 800 million to 1 billion people. So between the demographics and those in extreme poverty, the development needs are very significant. Another way to look at it is that on a global scale, more than 800 million people are still undernourished today. Or that nearly 1 billion people do not have access to electricity or do not have sufficient access to energy to meet their essential needs. So, all of this is interconnected, but if you don't have sufficient access to energy, you don't have the possibility, for example, to read in the evening to do your homework, so you receive a lower quality education, which means you have a reduced capacity for economic development to meet your needs and so on. Therefore, this combination of different factors that lead to and maintain significant populations, nearly 1 billion people in poverty, must be taken into account because demographic development and the development of these populations to access essential services will take place in the next 20 to 30 years. This figure shows the amount of energy consumed per person, on average by country. The darker the country, the more access the population has to energy. The lighter the country, the less access the population has to energy. So if money doesn't buy happiness, it must be acknowledged that it contributes to it, especially on a macro scale. Here, you have the representation of different countries with the level of satisfaction of their populations. The countries with the lowest earnings, on average less than $10,000 per year per person, are the countries where the dissatisfaction rate is highest among the population. And we see that this trend is decreasing. The more money the population earns, the less dissatisfied they are, and the more, in quotes, satisfied they become. So, after this overview, I hope we now have a better understanding of how human development, how the metabolism of our societies impacts living organisms, particularly mineral resources, and how does this set interact with planetary boundaries, even exceeding them in various ways, in a number of areas, including climate and biodiversity. And to summarize the magnitude of our challenge in 2 slides, it is about ensuring access to energy and sustainable economic development that can ultimately be achieved without fossil fuels. The economic development of humanity must once again become compatible with the functioning of the biosphere, particularly ensuring that we can feed ourselves while regenerating it. On the left, we have the impacts generated by development. This development has 4 components: the number of people who use a service, the population, P, the service itself, the quantity of services available, how many resources are mobilized to provide this service, and what impacts these resources have in delivering the service to the population. What we know is that the population will grow and that the service per person will also grow for a number of its parameters, in fact. For example, if we consider energy, we have just seen that the number of people on Earth will increase, and the amount of energy needed to provide essential services for the poorest who aspire to development will also increase. So what does this imply? It implies that if we want to reduce the impacts of each parameter, we will need to drastically reduce the resources required to provide these services and the impacts that these resources have in providing these services. If we take the case of energy, it means that to reduce impacts, for example on global warming, the amount of energy per service must decrease and the amount of carbon per energy must decrease. We must leverage all factors that allow us to decouple the production of services from impacts on the biosphere in various ways. If we extend this very generic principle to all essential services for the population, we arrive at this now well-known figure, which was developed by Kate Raworth, an economist who is interested in both planetary boundaries and essential services. If you disregard that part, we find ourselves back with Rockstrom's planetary boundaries model. We have climate change, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, biodiversity, etc. And on each of these elements, there are two concentric circles. The first one is the environmental ceiling, which we have covered, meaning the limits that should not be exceeded, because otherwise we compromise the biosphere's ability to regenerate. Below, she introduces an economic and socio-economic concept she calls the social floor, which consists of the essentials that must be provided to the entire global population, soon to be 9 billion people, ranging from income and education to food, employment, access to energy, etc. So this social floor and environmental ceiling define what she calls the donut, which is a torus shape, a ring, and this ring is the safe and just space for humanity that allows for inclusive and sustainable economic development. Inclusive because everyone has access to social floors, and sustainable because we do not exceed the various limits of the environmental ceiling. In 2015, the United Nations proposed another model to account for the objectives to be achieved and to frame the space for solutions. I called it the institutional framework of the space for solutions. These are known as the Sustainable Development Goals in English, or the Objectifs du Développement Durable in French. These 17 goals range from ending poverty, ending hunger worldwide, education for all, gender equality, biodiversity protection, climate stabilization, etc. They encompass social objectives, economic objectives, and environmental objectives, reflecting the need to act on all fronts to meet both the needs of populations and the restoration of ecosystems. We have a way to combine the two. This is the graph that is, in quotes, the donut revisited in the era of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we find again. So we find again in glory, so we find again conversation. The planetary boundaries are materialized by the SDGs, dedicated to the environment, climate, marine biodiversity, and terrestrial biodiversity, which correspond here to the environmental ceiling, then the place where humanity can develop, and then all the sustainable development goals presented here correspond to the essential needs that must be met for the entire world population. This means that the future economic development of humanity, if we want to ensure it is just, equitable, and sustainable, must align with this target. One of the essential points when discussing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is to keep in mind how interconnected they all are and how much they influence each other. This is a figure extracted from a site that comprehensively tracks all the SDGs and thoroughly their implementation. And the representation is as follows. Here you have a number of sectors: electricity, transport, industry, etc. Unsurprisingly, we observe that fundamentally every human activity impacts multiple SDGs, 1, 2, 5, 10, 17, demonstrating the correspondence between them and indicating that every action on one will have repercussions on another. There are some that are particularly connected, which we call nexuses, meaning SDGs that are closely linked, such as stabilizing the climate and providing access to energy. These are two things that operate through mechanisms that are extremely similar. There can be others, such as biodiversity and food and access to water. So there are a number of SDGs that are particularly coupled, but all the SDGs are very strongly interrelated. One alternative method to depict this interrelation is shown in the accompanying figure, which provides a visual representation to better understand the concept. The fact that each problem cannot be taken separately and must be considered as a whole, with an understanding of the correspondence between the different problems. What I have noted here, the problems are intimately and inextricably linked. Nature, politics, and the economy are now interconnected. This figure comes from the Global Risks Report, published in 2013 by the World Economic Forum, and I draw your attention to the different colors. The small green diamonds relate to risks posed by the environment, such as the collapse of biodiversity or the emergence of cyclones, etc. In blue, the blue diamonds clearly represent systemic financial risks. In red, you have issues that are related to governance. and in red, issues related to the economy. The least we can say is that all the diamonds are intimately connected. And another way to represent this, the World Economic Forum publishes its Global Risks Report every year and has released its color code based on different risks annually. Without going into detail, what I wanted to show you is the latest report of this year, which shows something particularly interesting. Since 2007, the issues were primarily financial, economic, and geopolitical, and since 2011, and even more so in the last 3 years, the major risks are green risks, that is, environmental risks. Therefore, the World Economic Forum considers that the risks likely to impact the global economic system, the most significant and concerning risks, are the most probable ones, and these are environmental risks. The risks that will have the greatest impact are also environmental risks. So there is a global awareness that the system needs to be radically changed. So, how much does the system need to change? That is indeed the whole question. This figure illustrates a way to frame the problem. It comes from a paper published 2 years ago that uses the principles of the donut we recently discussed. So on the vertical axis here, you have the social levels to be achieved, that is, how you ensure the essential needs of the populations. And on the x-axis, the number of planetary boundaries that are being transgressed. So if we apply the donut principle, we must both provide the population with a maximum of services and at the same time not exceed the planetary boundaries. What we observe is that countries are distributed in a crescent that carefully avoids coming this way. You either have countries where the population is fundamentally poor and has very little access to essential services, and at that point, their environmental impact is limited, or you have developed countries that are able to meet all the needs of their population but exceed the limits. And so, from that point of view, one can say that there is no distinction between developed countries and developing countries. Since the target is here, all the countries in the world are developing, as all countries are pursuing sustainable development. None has a model that, so far, satisfies both the needs of the populations and the needs of the planet. So, if we start with the orange line, for example, which represents GDP, GDP is an indicator of economic development, but it does not fully correspond, for example, to the prosperity of populations and their well-being. So the first decoupling to be done is to concentrate not on an economic indicator, but indeed on a well-being indicator, namely how to maximize the well-being of populations. Once we have this social floor objective, we can certainly look at what the other criteria are. And today, GDP is fundamentally linked to significant resource use, whether material or energy, and thus this results in waste. So we need what is called resource decoupling, which means producing more not of GDP but of well-being with fewer resources. Moreover, these resources themselves have a role and an impact on the environment. Therefore, it is about achieving a second decoupling, which is the impact, a decoupling of the impact. So to summarize, we start from a situation where today the economy's main indicator is GDP, and this GDP grows with a very significant increase in resources. We need to transition to an economy that increases well-being while drastically reducing environmental impact. It is clear that this is not about small gestures for the planet. What is needed is a profound transformation of our development model, of our civilization model. The way Johan Rockström summarizes it is as follows. Indeed, abundance within planetary boundaries requires a significant and profound change in mindset. It is not growth without limits, it is not limited growth, it is growth within limits. This economic model is largely yet to be built in its entirety and fully. In the last 2 slides, I would like to present a number of characteristics needed to evaluate the quality of the options on the table and to consider the solutions we can implement. Given the complexity and interrelation of the issues, approaches must be systemic. It means thoroughly understanding the problem space, understanding the connection between different problems to be able to identify the best levers. A second characteristic is that we need all types of expertise from all disciplines. Whatever the subject we are going to address, we will need to discuss and bring together all the necessary expertise to approach the issue in a systemic manner. A third characteristic is that they must be integrated. Since each sustainable development goal impacts the others, this is another way to express this systemic and interdisciplinary necessity, we need to be able to imagine solutions that potentially have co-benefits for other sustainable development goals, but must avoid as much as possible having adverse side effects on other goals. A fourth characteristic of these approaches is that they must be complementary. If you imagine a pie chart divided into slices, you can have one solution that accounts for 5%, another solution that accounts for 10%, and another that accounts for 3%. If we combine a number of these solutions, we can more easily approach a solution than if we try to find the one solution that does everything. Indeed, the space for solutions will necessarily be built much more easily through a combination of complementary approaches than by a hypothetical single solution that would solve everything. And the final characteristic of these approaches is their agnosticism in nature. What does that mean? There are different ways to approach sustainability in various ways. For example, some advocate for massively reducing consumption, while others advocate for massively investing in innovation. Today, across the entire spectrum, there are so many challenges that it is necessary to combine all approaches. We must both reduce everything that can be reduced and innovate to transform production systems, food systems, etc. Finally, if we are interested in what a good solution might be, a good solution must be able to be deployed quickly and easily. And for that, it must meet a certain number of criteria. I have listed 4 here, but there are obviously many more. The first one is feasibility. Can this solution be implemented quickly? Can it be implemented quickly on a large scale? It raises a whole host of problems when you delve a bit deeper into the details. Is there enough raw material or energy to design it? Can the supply chains develop? Does it not take up too much space? There is a second characteristic, which is the cost. Can this solution be cheaper or not than the current system? If you have a possible solution that is much more expensive than the current system, it will have a much harder time entering the market or being accepted. A third point on this notion of acceptability, there are 2 more parameters that I wanted to mention here. Governance is important. If we consider the number of people who need to decide or agree in advance that this solution should be developed or implemented, the more people there are, obviously the higher the risk that this solution cannot be mobilized. Finally, social acceptability is a key factor. The number of people likely to adopt it is also something important, depending on sensitivity or culture. Some people will want to change their behavior or not, and thus this social acceptability is key for large-scale development and implementation.